Harvey. When I get an introduction like that, I always think about the piano player in the Western Saloon who has a sign above it, "Don't shoot the piano player, he's doing the best that he can." You'd like to have a little more deflative kind of introduction, but I'm sure all of you know at least the outlines, and I suddenly realized in Alabama I don't have to tell the story of the Scottsboro case, the 9 African-American teenagers who were falsely accused of raping 2 white women on a train in 1931 in North Alabama and ended up spending from 6 to 19 years in prison and very nearly executed on several occasions. So I'll skip that part of my introduction and focus really upon the exhibit, which is now opening, and some reflections on this. We all know the cliche, "A picture is worth 1,000 words." Frederick Bernard, who is a manager of a New York advertising agency, coined that phrase in 1921, arguing that pictures, which were just becoming very common in magazines and newspapers, were more powerful than words when it came to selling products from cosmetics to cars. Well, even though the phrase originated as a marketing tool, Bernard's words have the ring of truth. If we think of some of the most vivid events of the past 100 years, our mind is likely to race toward pictures rather than words. If I can get my... Okay, here we go again there. That's... Is it done? Let's see.
Use the roller to roll it towards.
Okay, that's great. A little tech lesson here. We went over this one time. Dorothea Lange's Depression-era photograph of the despairing face of a 32-year-old mother of 7 at a migrant labor camp in California. The raising of the flag at Iwo Jima. Frame 313, that gruesome image from the Zapruder amateur film documenting the instant that ended John Kennedy's life. And for those of you who are my age, you'll certainly remember the Life magazine photograph of the naked 9-year-old Vietnamese girl rushing down the road toward an unseen cameraman, her clothes burned away by liquid napalm. Or the iconic photograph of apprehensive New York policemen ascending the stairways to their deaths as 9/11 workers fled downward to the streets below. So we meet to mark the opening of another extraordinary exhibit of photographs, in this case documenting the infamous trials of the so-called Scottsboro boys. These photographs help us to see and imagine in a visceral way what the past must have been like. They give us reference points for a remembrance of a nightmare that consumed the lives of 9 teenagers and disgraced the state of Alabama. But I want to reflect on more than just these specific photographs, to talk a bit about images, memories, what we remember and what we forget. Looking back, I can still see myself as a child. I think I was at my grandmother's house, I'm not sure. I was standing between 2 mirrors that opened up. As I looked from side to side, I realized that my image reflected from one mirror back to the other, repeated again and again, growing smaller and more indistinct with each repetition. More than a half century later, I remember this with astonishing clarity. But I can't remember how old I was, where I was. I think I was at my grandmother's. I can't remember anything about that except that vivid moment. However fragmentary, all of us could think of moments in our lives that remain with us, in some cases that haunt us. In other cases, we're only mystified by their intensity. Why do we remember this moment and not others? And why do we forget? Much the same can be said of our collective memory, what we call history. We often fail to see the connection between textbook history, the things we learned in classrooms, and personal recollections about our childhood or our family or even our community. And it is true that some of the most intense reflections on our past are personal, private. But it is also true that even personal memories are often interwoven with that larger history, and particularly our group identity within that history. As a nation, as a community, as a people, as a region, we remember and we forget. Now, it's a commonplace observation that collective memory, whether, as I said, of a nation, an ethnic group, or even a community, is created, produced, manufactured at times. And while historians sometimes play a role in that process, I've often tried to teach my students, droning on and on and on. Historians and even popular writers of history, however, play a relatively small role in that process. Think about it. We know from many surveys that Americans are notoriously ignorant of what we think of as the facts, the important facts about our past. Yet most people have a real sense of history, and most of it comes from sources far removed from the classroom, from textbooks, or even from historical works. They come from popular culture, movies, televisions, historical novels, from museums, public celebrations, from the speeches of politicians that often evoke the lessons of the past, from the very landscape of our lives, the historical markers we see on the road, the chambers of commerce versions of history that are promoted to try to develop a area as a target for tourists. What we think of as history is always a complex blend of fact, myth, dream, reality. And over the last quarter century, psychologists and cognitive scientists of every kind have begun to explore this complex problem of collectively remembering and forgetting. It's a subject increasingly important to historians. It's important to us to remember to think about what people remember and what they forget. There are dozens of work that have been published in the last 25 years. Nevertheless, I assume most of us haven't read all of them, so I'll see if I can summarize what I think I learned from all these in my own observations. First, although we may try to be truthful in our recollection of past events, our historical memory, as I said, is a product of conscious and unconscious construction and reconstruction. I spent years studying George Wallace. I did over 80 interviews. I read the transcripts of another 120. I also studied the original sources. I found the interviews fascinating, sometimes humorous, sometimes insightful. But as I compared those memories, and that's what they were, as people talked to me and I interviewed them 25 years later, as I compared those to what I think I knew as the facts, I saw this great chasm that existed. And with each interview, I learned an important lesson about memory. It's not simply that we forget. The more fundamental problem is that we constantly recreate memory so that our past can live comfortably with the present. No wonder the modern English dramatist Harold Pinter cynically describes stories of the past as what you remember, imagine you remember, convince yourself you remember, or pretend to remember. The second thing, we recreate our memories at first. The second is that the genealogy, the history of almost any group, its self-identity, its heritage, is usually positive. Like Shakespeare's monster Caliban, We convince ourselves that we're surrounded by the sounds and sweet airs of a past that only gives delight and hurts not. And again, like Caliban, we drift into reveries of a past that is so comforting that when we wake to reality, we cry to dream again. Now, sometimes it is true that a sense of our past is a recitation of past grievances in which victimization becomes the central thread. But whether nostalgic or painful, that historical self-portrait is frankly not self-critical very often. Now, I think nowhere is this more true than in our own region. For most of my adult life, certainly when I became a historian, I constantly heard politicians and pundits, and even a few historians, glibly generalize about what Southerners think about this or that subject. Whenever I got the chance, I always asked him to repeat these words, only this time adding the preface, black. What do black Southerners think? And quite often, the result was quite different. The unthinking equation of whiteness with Southernness was understandable for our public members, and until the last 25 or 30 years have been white members. To white Southerners, African Americans in their midst have been stage props in a drama in which all the speaking parts were white. Some years ago, while wandering through the stacks of the library at the University of South Carolina, I stumbled upon the very text that I used in my 8th grade history of South Carolina, Mary Sims Oliphant, on slavery. The planters took pride in seeing their slaves were well cared for. On many plantations, there were hospitals for the slaves, nurseries for the little children, and recreations of various kinds. In fact, concluded Miss Sims, it was the slave and not the master who received the real benefits of slavery. All right. On emancipation, the former slaves were ignorant and uneducated, unable to make a living without the supervision of the white man. They stole cattle and chickens and hogs, burned barns and stables. They were not willing to work. They were like children playing hooky. Only, if I can get the right one here, that's the barn dance. Only with the brave efforts of the Ku Klux Klan were persecuted whites able to frighten the superstitious Negroes into submission. To this day, she said approvingly, this was written in 1954, South Carolina has a white man's government. Now, this textbook in 1954 was used in my school. It was used in black schools. Imagine, you're a black student, you're reading this in school. That was the story. That was the story of our past. Of course, there were always Southerners, black Southerners, who told a different story. Throughout the 1880s and 1890s, African Americans living amidst men and women who had seen slavery, the fight for freedom and Reconstruction firsthand, kept alive within the black community their own quite different memories of the past. Orators at Emancipation Day and July 4th celebrations were particularly important in maintaining this story. I once ran across some extraordinary photographs in the Library of Congress, and it showed celebrations of Emancipation Day in Beaufort, South Carolina. There were 4,000 African Americans gathered to hear 6 hours of speeches about emancipation. I went to the Beaufort newspaper. There was not one word, not even a mention of the occasion. Another example of the way in which, to most white Southerners, blacks were simply invisible. Well, now that changed. The Civil Rights Movement changed that. The way in which historians looked at the past changed that. And sometimes a step ahead, a step behind, the voices of black Southerners and those who wrote about their history pushed outward. And in the work of novelists, professional and amateur historians, popular culture, America learned a new story. Roots was one of the first examples of it. Step by step, The keepers of the old myths retreated, just as we eradicated slavery from the profound connection to the Civil War. The explicit racism that justified the Southern way of life receded. The ghoulish garments that clad the story of Reconstruction were put away. They were seldom repudiated, but placed into a storage closet of half-forgotten memories. Slavery had to be acknowledged, but as an unfortunate episode of family history, to be briefly mentioned and then passed over. And so the hoop skirts and the columned mansions remain in tourist brochures, but increasingly as shadows of their former vitality. Which brings me back to the subject of this exhibit. We now know with certainty that 9 innocent black teenagers were convicted of a crime they did not commit and suffered for years in unimaginable ways. Clarence Norris was released in 1950 after serving 19 years under unimaginable conditions for a crime he did not commit. Others, 2 as young as 13 years old, spent from 6 to 18 years in prison. It could have happened almost anywhere in the South of the 1930s, but it took place in Alabama. And although I'm not a native-born Alabamian, I had the good sense to marry one. And I think whether you're a native of the state or not, certainly as Southerners, we wince as we recall. If we're white, you wince as you recall that story. The people of Alabama, the white people of Alabama, were the most part good, decent people, and yet many of them committed or justified shameful acts. No wonder when I began research in the late 1960s, only 15 years after the release of Clarence Norris, many white Alabamians either professed to remember nothing about the case or refused to talk about it, sometimes refused in a very hostile way. I should add, most emphatically, this was not the case of older black Alabamians, many of whom could remember with vivid detail everything that had taken place in that case. 2 entirely different sets of memories that came out of the 1930s. Understandably, we try, as we look back on it, to think positively about it. There must be, as with other things, there must be something good that comes out of it. And so we cling to those memories. We remember people like, if any of you know the story, James Edwin Horton, the courageous Alabama judge from North Alabama who sacrificed his career. He was scheduled to be appointed to the Alabama Supreme Court, the great thing he had always wanted, but he refused to allow the conviction, overturn the conviction in his court, and said he would never allow a conviction of the Scottsboro defendants. It took extraordinary courage. He was defeated, of course, in the next election. But there were other white Alabamians who stood against the currents. Clarence Watts, a Huntsville attorney who defended them despite the fact that it cost his law firm many clients. The Reverend Henry Edmonds, of Birmingham Presbyterian minister, who took a forthright position. Benjamin Goldstein of Montgomery, the Montgomery rabbi who was forced to leave his congregation. Other white Alabamians. Still, as I look back, I'm drawn to the stories of the black Alabamians who said, "Enough, I will no longer remain silent." One by one, they did something that would have seemed unheard of in the 1920s. They stood up, they took the witness stand in Decatur and testified and placed themselves in harm's way. There was a doctor, a dentist. This is a Decatur dentist. But the one, and I couldn't find a photograph of him, the one that I remember and I will always think about is a 51-year-old plasterer, black plasterer from Scottsboro, Alabama, named John Sanford. John Sanford was 90% of his business, he was dependent upon whites. And yet, when they asked him if he would testify that he was qualified to be a juror, which he had never been called, and that he knew of other African Americans who were qualified, knowing full well the consequences, He didn't even hesitate when Samuel Leibowitz, the attorney, asked him to do it. He said, "Of course I will." Now, we think we have courage under some circumstances. That's courage beyond what most of us are capable of having. To me, these individuals are the greatest heroes of the decade, and even though we think of the civil rights movement of the 60s as a turning point, I think of the 30s as that turning point in which black Alabamians and black Southerners said, "I'm not going to simply tip my hat and say yes anymore." We honor them. We are less comfortable in emphasizing the fact that they were swimming against a tide of fear. And the fact is, none of us are very comfortable in talking about such unpleasant aspects of our past. Implicit is the argument. Why should we dredge up memories of that time when fear and hatred divided black and white? Far better that we smooth the rough and crooked places of our historical memory and turn toward the future. And there really is there's a precedent for this. The 19th century French historian Ernest Renan argued that almost every country, every community is a place of shared memory and of shared forgetting. The act of forgetting, he insisted, was essential if people with a long history of conflict were to end the age-old cycle of accusation and recrimination that kept alive past hatreds. But I prefer the ancient wisdom of the Jewish tradition. Only remembrance can bring redemption. This does not mean that times have not changed so that we should let memories of a bitter past blind us to the journeys we've made and the opportunities that lie ahead. So much has happened in the past half century for the better as the harshest contours of American racism have passed away. But forgetfulness is not the answer. We can never break the cycle of accusation, denial, victimization, recrimination, resentment without coming to terms with that history. This is not a matter of white Southerners issuing an apology or wallowing in guilt. No one here was responsible for the worst and the worst of these events of an earlier generation. But we live with their consequences every day. In the aftermath of black majority rule, South Africa's Nobel laureate Bishop Desmond Tutu repeatedly spoke of the need for black South Africans to put aside their anger toward whites as they built a new South Africa. This is from a series of billboards around the country. There is no future without forgiveness. But he said that this call for forgiveness must always be part of a larger equation. Without, he said, a truthful memory of all the past, however painful, however uncomfortable, there is no healing. That is the fundamental basis for the foundation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. You tell the true story, and then you engage in this act of collective forgiveness. Now, of course, African Americans are not immune from myth-making. Today, I think we can all agree that the struggle for civil rights was a morally righteous one, but not every soldier in the battle was a saint. Beneath the mythology of the triumph of the civil rights movement is a messy tapestry of anger, frustration, often bitter struggles among individuals with strong egos. Insisting on the infallibility and the moral perfection of the men and women who surmounted their own weaknesses and fought segregation and built a great cause is self-defeating. We remember them not because they were flawless, but because their larger vision helped them to rise above their flaws. Still, it is white Southerners who have dominated our regional memories. And for nearly 200 years, the foundation of an unjust society rested upon these false and comforting myths. For whites, abandoning those while acknowledging our painful past is not easy, but Bishop Tutu was right. Without that willingness to confront the past, all of it, there's no healing. This doesn't mean that the past offers easy and obvious answers. I've always winced when I hear that famous aphorism, those who remember cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. But which past? And how are we to learn those lessons, to carry them to the present 80 years later? Well, for me, the greatest mistake would be to see the Scottsboro case, to look at these photographs and see them simply as an example of racial oppression and injustice in the 1930s. When I was president at Scottsboro earlier this year and the governor signed a pardon, it was a great day, the official pardon, pardoning all the Scottsboro defendants. But I was deeply unsettled by the self-congratulatory tone of the event. The implication seemed to be, that was yesterday, this is today. We live in a world relatively free from racism and prejudice. And of course racism has declined. But it is part, even as it continues, it is part of the long history of some of the darkest themes in our nation's history. And that is the tendency to mark out one group and then another as somehow unworthy of human dignity and worth. Native Americans, Jews, Catholics, rednecks, immigrants of every stripe, homosexuals, Muslims, at one time or another, all have been seen as outside the circle of our common humanity. And the poor and the socially isolated as well. The two women who accused these black teenagers falsely of rape were Victoria Price and Ruby Bates. We scorn them today, but in their own way, they were victims as well, forced into prostitution to support themselves during the desperate times of the Depression. Most respectable whites privately dismissed them as poor white trash. Is it any wonder that they seized upon the one symbol of worth and dignity they possessed, their white Southern womanhood, and used it to elevate themselves from their wretched condition? There are many ways in which I think the threads of Scottsboro reach into today. It's a different world, and yet it's the same world. How else can we explain an America that with 5% of the world's population has 25% of the world's prison population? Most of that increase coming in the last 30 years. How can we explain a system in which 1 in 6 young black and Hispanic men will come under the purview of the justice system? A system in which African Americans use drugs at a lower rate than whites do, and yet they are 5 times as likely to be incarcerated for drug offenses. Jane and I lived in the Netherlands, a country of 17 million people. Anybody know how many people are in prison in the Netherlands? 10,000 in the entire Netherlands. 10,000 people. Yet their crime rate has not skyrocketed. They've not suffered from an influx, and they have reduced their population from about 36,000 to 10,000. I look at this and I say, well, what's the connection to Scottsboro? It is that same notion. If 1 in every 6 white young men were in prison today, I cannot believe that we would not be addressing this with an absolute commitment to doing something about it, to ending this vicious cycle of marking young men outside the common circle of our humanity. Well, the greatest strength in our country has been a willingness to act, a willingness to address problems. The mobilization of black and white Americans to fight the Scottsboro verdicts quickly evolved into far more than a struggle for a fair trial. I think it led directly to the civil rights movement of the 1960s, and that struggle was over more than the right to buy a hot dog at a lunch counter or even to cast a vote. Those who shaped the fight for civil rights beginning in the 1930s and through the 60s used the term beloved community without the italics of irony. However naive they may seem in respect, they held up a vision of an America freed from fearfulness, marked by a compassion for the weak, and committed to genuine opportunity, not fake opportunity, genuine opportunity for those who live in an iron cage of poverty and social isolation. Above all, they fought against what seems to be our growing compulsion to divide ourselves between the worthy and the unworthy. Dare I say it, the takers and the makers, the true Americans and the other. As a historian, I've always been concerned about the truthfulness of our recreation of the past, but I also share the view of the Russian novelist Leo Tolstoy. History worth writing or reading should ultimately lead to some form of moral reflection. At its best, a conversation with our past can do more than inform us about what people have said and done. It can help us to think about how we should live. That's fine in the abstract. Less so as I try to retain some remnant of optimism in a world of violence and a nation divided on the most fundamental levels. More and more, the goals that inspired me in the 1960s seem like a mirage in an endless desert of self-interest and greed, in which we are contemptuous of the very notion of a community of shared values, of a nation committed to protecting the worth and dignity of every citizen. All of us are familiar with a quote by William Faulkner, "The past is never dead. It's not even past." Well, Scottsboro is not simply the past, and it is still very much a part of the present. At times, as I said, I'm ashamed to say it makes me despair of the future. And then I remember an essay I read several years ago by Joanna Macy. Macy, a leading scholar of modern Buddhism, visited a group of Tibetan monks in the 1980s. Their monastery had been destroyed by the Chinese government, their 1,200-year-old monastery. Working with nothing more than hand tools and wheelbarrows, they had begun rebuilding their monastery. To Macy, this reconstruction with such limited resources seemed overwhelming. What if the Chinese should simply return again with their bulldozers, she asked the monks. They shrugged. Macy saw that such calculations were conjecture to the monks. Since we cannot see the future, you simply proceed to put one stone on top of another, and another on top of that. And if the stones get knocked down, you begin again. Because if you don't, nothing will get built. These photographs remind us that we cannot change the past any more than we can foresee the future. But it is within our power to shape that future. If the stones get knocked down, you have to begin again, because if you don't, nothing will get built. Thank you very much. I'm glad taking a question at any time.
Take a few questions.
Sure, absolutely.
We've got time for a few questions, but before we do that, I want to mention to you that we have the revised edition of Dr. Carter's book available for purchase. You can buy it now on our front desk, and Dr. Carter will be glad to sign it for you. I'm sure it'll be down there shortly. So we've got time for a few questions.
Okay. Is it possible, sir, to kind of give us a little background of something I'm not that familiar
With the case,
with how all of this got started with the Scottsboro?
well, it started with segregation. It started on a freight train in which there were a group of black and white hobos. You know, over 135,000 young men and a few young women were on the rails in the Depression, the early 1930s. This was 1931. And some black kids who were hoboing, trying to get out of the wind, moved to a church car which had a side up on it. And the white hobos who were there said, "This car is only for whites." And a fight took place, and several of the white boys jumped off the train when it slowed down and called the sheriff, and they stopped the train, and there were 2 women on the train, 2 women hobos. These were the 2 that I was talking about, Victoria Price and Ruby Bates, and they were afraid. They had been they had been into Tennessee, and they were afraid. They didn't understand the Mann Act. They thought they were going to be arrested for crossing the state line for illegal purposes, prostitution. And so they thought the best way to get out of it was to claim they had been raped. That's how the case began. And once it began, it assumed a momentum all its own. Even when the evidence began to mount that no such rape had taken place. You were into this thing in the 1930s in which once the accusation was made, you couldn't back down, because then it encouraged blacks to commit rape if you didn't punish them, even if they were innocent. That's not exactly. So the case then continues in trial after trial after trial in the 1930s, and the reason it continues in so many trials is because the Communist Party stepped in the middle of the Depression. It wasn't illegal in the 30s, took charge of the case, and mounted an extraordinary legal campaign in which they appealed to the Supreme Court 3 times. And there are 2 major, I don't know of any other civil rights case in which there are 2 major decisions that come out of the Scottsboro case. Alabama, Alabama's done a lot for the civil rights movement. I mean, in the Scottsboro case, you had the decision which guaranteed, prevented all white juries. You had the first of them said you had to have effective legal counsel. Those aren't always lived up to, but those are important. And Alabama gave us Bull Connor. I mean, without Bull Connor, I'm convinced there wouldn't have been such a great civil rights victory in the 1960s. So Alabama's given us a lot, in the civil rights movement. But that's, if you really want to know all the details, all 460 pages of it, no, it's not that much, is available in my book there. That's no question. Yes.
Question mark. I think you mentioned that there were some of the boys were as young as 12 or 13.
13.
Did they also go to trial, or did they let them go?
There were two that were 13, but the for some reason the prosecution decided one of them was 14. That made him okay to. Well, the prosecutor decided that the 13-year-old would be tried, but he would only ask for life imprisonment rather than death in the electric chair. And when it went to the jury, 11 of the 12 jurors wanted to execute him. But one juror held out for life imprisonment, and they ended up with a hung jury. And so in the case of Eugene Patterson, he was never convicted, but he stayed in prison until 1937, waiting to be tried again. The other, who was also 13 years old, was convicted and sentenced to death in the electric chair. The case was appealed to the Supreme Court, and it was set aside. It went back to Judge Horton. He set it aside, went back to, the state of Alabama was not about to give up on these cases. It kept on going right on through the 30s there. Yes?
What happened to the women?
To the women?
Yeah.
What?
And the second part of that question, did they have any heirs?
Yes, they do. They do. One of the women sued me, so I have a very vivid memory of her. The two women, after the trials were over, one of them moved to the West Coast. It's real complicated. One of them renounced her charge, and in the second trial before Judge Horton, she said that no rape had taken place. They were convicted anyway. It didn't make any difference. But Ruby Bates was her name, and she moved out to the West Coast. The other one, Victoria Price, changed her name after all these trials were over. And she never read my book, unfortunately. For some reason, I don't think she was a big book reader. But when the film came out based upon my book in 1977, then she sued everybody she could think of, including me. But then they found out how little money I had, and I got dropped from the whole thing there, and they sued NBC, and there was a big trial in Tennessee about it, in which she repeated once more the claim that she had been raped, and eventually the case was settled out of court. You know that? Yes.
you advised us to become reconciled to history truly understood. Could that understanding include the realization that convicting the innocent was not a mistake? That if you're trying to maintain a system of racial apartheid that will be resisted, the only way you can do that is to display an authority that is vengeful and random.
And unwavering.
What?
And unwavering.
Yes, and strikes out in a terroristic fashion at the innocent in order to make a point to everybody else about its capacity to stomp on anybody for any reason at any time, and therefore convicting the innocent is not a mistake in that sense.
Oh, absolutely. If you represent that point of view, it makes perfectly good sense. My thing is, I think even though in reality people act that way, if you really press people, it'd be hard pressed even in the 1930s to get most people to admit that. And so there's always been this tension between the power we exercise, the way we use power, and the values that I think most people really do have. I think privately, and in that sense, I'm a political pessimist and a personal optimist. That is, I believe that most people, deep down, really do value things like fairness, equality. As I said, I'm an optimist in that respect. And the tension comes when you then begin to elevate self-interest to such an extent that you're willing to use that power for any purpose, even when it contradicts your own deepest kinds of convictions. And that's why I say, to me, the greatest sin, being raised as a good Southern Baptist, I can use that term, the greatest sin is this sense of separating other people into them and us. And that was the ultimate expression of that. I mean, how else? If any of you see the exhibit, you'll see the most remarkable thing, and that is these photographs are taken by a Japanese American, he's born in Hawaii, married to a white woman in Decatur, Alabama, and a respected member of the community. Now, does that fit with what we think? Yeah, it fits, because in the South you had the ultimate other. For white Southerners, blacks were the ultimate other. So you could welcome Jews, you could welcome other ethnic groups with far less difficulty than you did in other parts of the nation. I really believe that. I mean, in that sense, to me, it's just one more reflection of how we can use it. And don't think that it's not here today. My wife and I were driving over from Atlanta the other day, and we were in that dead hole between Atlanta and Birmingham. We were going to Birmingham, I was giving a talk, and the only thing we could find, no reflection now, was Christian radio. And we had a news program on Christian radio, and it was the most vile, despicable slandering of Muslims. I mean, I sat there and I listened to it, and I thought, I can't listen to this anymore, and I turned it off. So it's one group one time, one group another time. Sounds like I'm up here trying to give you the altar call here, but that's yes. Yeah.
You know, Flip Wilson made a statement frequently when he was doing his comedy shows, which may have some truth to it, and it may also tie in with the fact that these young white men who jumped off the train when they were about to be beaten away by these non-black guys. And the statement was simply that a lie is just as good as the truth as long as you can get somebody to believe it. And when these young white men went and started the entire myth about these women having been raped, then it just got out of shape.
And people wanted to believe it. I mean, it was important. You had to believe that was the case, because how else could you justify the system you had created? Yeah, that was great. Thank you very much for coming out.